Yeah. Sorry, I can't actually see the screen as well.
Yes, we can see them. That's
Okay,
great.
okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so I'm Dr. Karen Jones. I'm from the Institute of Education at the University of Reading. And what I'm going to present today is some research that's set out to examine factors contributing to the underrepresentation of women and ethnic minorities in professorial and senior academic leadership positions in particular. And of course, the challenges that academics face don't just occur just prior to reaching those sorts of levels. My research, other projects that I've had, and I know the wider literature points to there being an array of issues at various points across the academic kind of career track, from the earliest right through to the latter stages. So academics from all different career levels were included in the study. I'll start would just give you a picture, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but I'll just highlight a few key statistics just to set the scene. So I'm sure you're aware that the Higher Education Statistics Agency collects data on a regular basis from UK higher education institutions on the composition of the staff workforce and also the student population as well. I'll be talking about the staff workforce, and what the data shows is that women make up just under half of the total academic workforce, but they are 31% of professors. So there are significant gaps in the professoriate. And women are about 42% of other senior academic roles as well. So we haven't quite achieved parity there either. Now, when you look across, looking across this from the perspective of intersectionality, looking at ethnicity and sex, you start to see even more pronounced differences. Um, and you'll see on the slide here what I've shown is all ethnicities, but the statistics show that the figures plummet significantly for minority ethnic females. So obviously the figures are always changing, and I've looked at the statistical release that was from earlier in 2024 that reported data for 2022, 23. And at that point, and I don't think it's changed massively, it showed that 9% of the total academic workforce was made up of ethnic minority females, 3.4% of professors, but this varied across different ethnic groups. So Asian staff, academic staff were the highest proportion, but still only 2%. 0.7% were of mixed ethnicity and 0.5% other minority ethnicities and 0.2% Black ethnicity. So the figures just plummet and plummet through those different groups. And a similar picture is portrayed for other senior academic staff roles as well. My project was at one university in the UK, and it set out to explore this. This particular university had quite pronounced, gaps, ethnic and gender gaps in the professoriate and in senior leadership roles. And there was a desire to investigate this, and it was one of the key policy priorities. So I'm reporting some of the key findings from that study, but obviously not everything in the time available. The theoretical framework for my research draws on feminist standpoint theory as an epistemological stance aimed at it's a type of critical theory, and it's aimed at empowering oppressed groups and improving their situation. And while it's firmly rooted in feminism, it's also connected with anti-racism and post-colonial thought, and it has important roots in Marxist epistemological position as well. And I draw on intersectionality to describe how multiple forms of identity can compound and result in intersecting forms of discrimination. And related to this, I draw on critical race theory as a means for examining the embedded nature of racism in social structures and norms. And the reason for doing this is an attempt to reveal practices that are often hidden beneath a veneer of normality. I'm well aware as my positionality in this research as a white female researcher. So I acknowledge that in some respects, when it comes to the feminist standpoint, I'm very much an insider, but on other aspects, such as the minority ethnic experiences, I'm very much an outsider in these parts of the research. But my overall aim is to give this sort of counter narrative to the dominant discourse of that we see, of neoliberal sort of ideology of meritocracy in higher education, to give a voice to those that have been discriminated against. And I hope that this helps in some way to chip away and to create greater equity across the sector. So I'll tell you briefly about the study. So the data was collected via a mixed methods online survey. The intention was to follow this up with qualitative research, and while that was initially funded, the funding was withdrawn later due to the COVID pandemic, and as something of a funding crisis around that period. So my online mixed methods survey was also significantly affected by COVID. So it literally was launched at the onset of lockdowns. Obviously, I had no idea of that at the time that it would clash. Um, but nevertheless, 186 academic staff took part. 51% white females, 29% white males, 11% ethnic minority females, and a very tiny number, just 7 ethnic minority males. I also found that the males gave fewer answers to the open questions in the survey. While the survey gathered quantitative data, it also sought to gather qualitative data. And overall, I gathered some very rich data, qualitative data, but less so from the males. But overall, the sample represented a mix of staff from STEM and non-STEM, and different contract types and different career stages. And my intention was to initially, before I gathered the data, it had been to conduct intersectional analysis, looking across sex and ethnicity. But because of the numbers of ethnic minority participants, particularly the small number of males, it wasn't possible to do that in the statistical tests, but I have attempted to do so more in the qualitative data, and I've done what I can with the data, put it that way. So I'm going to share, some of the key findings with you next. So one of the first things I explored in the survey was how encouraged people felt in their work to progress in their career, to advance to the next step. So for some, that was early career stage progression. For others, it was literally into professorial and senior leadership roles. And what I found was a statistically significant association between the variable of being encouraged by others and ethnicity. And this is important because what it shows is that those of white ethnicity were much more likely to say they were encouraged by others more than those in the minority ethnic groups. And this has important implications because there's a vast literature that shows encouragement at work plays an important role in helping a person to advance in their career. especially into those more senior positions where you do often need references and statements of support for your personal titles application and so forth, and for promotion applications. And it can also help people to build confidence, and it can nurture an individual growth, just having encouragement from other people, and help individuals to sort of navigate the challenges that they experience in their careers, enabling them to sort of take on these more senior roles. So that's an important finding. So I also looked at the sort of general picture across the sort of activities that participants in the survey were engaged in. So I was using the concept of the prestige economy here, which has been developed in the work of Candico Hausen et al. And I examined roles and academic activities that are often used as metrics to measure academic success. And what I found was that a higher percentage of white males were undertaking some of these activities. So to provide an example here, 61% of white males had been invited to be a keynote speaker at a national or international conference, and that compared with 57% of ethnic minority males who'd been invited to be a keynote speaker at a national or international conference. And then you can see how the figure dips for white females to 51%, and it dips even lower to 37% for ethnic minority females. And although across the different types of prestige economy type activities, there was some variation. These things are, things like being invited to be a keynote speaker. This is really important, again, on a professional titles application. Personal titles application, sorry, it's really important that you've got these kind of things to evidence that you are that you're esteemed in your field, that people recognize you for your knowledge internationally. So this can have implications further down the line on any applications for personal titles and those very senior positions. Now, this was a common theme in the qualitative data, which I'll turn to in more detail next. So lack of opportunity for women, especially ethnic minority women, came out strongly in the data. And I provide some excerpts on the slide here from two different women which illustrate this well. So one of them you can see points out that the criteria for promotions relies on honorary awards and accolades that are just not available to minority women. And the other one points out that even within the professorial band, reaching those very high bands of band 3 and 4, which are the sort of top bands, is extremely difficult, because you need to get honours and awards and prizes and grant money, which are much more difficult to acquire. And I think what's interesting here is the way that they're aware of the oppression, but view it as an everyday part of institutional life, even referring to it in the second excerpt with a touch of light humour, with the exclamation mark at the end of the data. So the qualitative data revealed that women and minorities are particularly disadvantaged by inequitable access to important networks as well, as shown in this excerpt here. And this again is important because these networks can confer a sense of belonging, they can provide important knowledge and know-how, how to sort of navigate the system, who you need to speak to get on in your career, knowledge about projects that you can perhaps, get involved in, and so forth. So they're really important in very subtle ways to career advancement. And another common barrier that came up in the data in the second quote there is lack of fit with these dominant sort of groups, these dominant white masculine prototype cliques within the senior leadership teams. And there was a sort of double-edged sword coming out within the data, where on the one hand, participants felt highly visible because they were different, but also invisible because their work was just different. So, for example, because they did leadership differently, because they, even though their work was highly valued, they felt alienated by the very highly superficial box ticking approach taken by institutions, and they were, working away, supporting students, but felt that they weren't valued. And this sense of being different came out in a number of different excerpts, and I've got another one here. So this woman in this excerpt refers to being teetotal as well, being automatically excluded from pub sessions, and even though her research was published in world-leading journals, she felt constantly sort of denigrated in the department, and her teaching was, although her teaching was awarded, had been awarded, nominated for awards and prizes, she fell under direct attack and indirect attack on a regular basis. So another theme in the data was that of silencing, which I've heard in other talks today, in some of the other sessions. So I know this is a rather long quote from the data, so I won't go through all of it, but this is where the title of the talk comes from. So this fact that there's open racism, sexism towards this person and some of their students, but when it's raised even at the highest levels, just much was done. In other words, racism and sexism are permitted by default. So there are lots of intentions of, goodwill intentions, but when things get embarrassing or difficult or complex, there's really very little real action. And again, this notion of a tick box exercise came up again. In terms of the going back to some of the quantitative data, I did look at this from a more descriptive statistics perspective, given the sort of numbers of participants I had. I just looked across different ethnicities. And what you can see is when asked to staff speak up when they see an instance of unfair treatment or discrimination, 42% of white respondents said yes. 16.7% of ethnic minority staff said yes, but when it came to no, there are striking differences. So 50% of ethnic minority staff said no, they don't speak up. 16.5% of white staff said no, they don't speak up. And then there are other figures in the don't know category. And again, this idea that it's the problem is that people perceive themselves to be good people, and they believe they don't engage in discriminatory practices, but they do so often inadvertently on an everyday basis without even realizing it. So the data indicated that a sense of white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, and it's not, the quote, the definitions of this suggest it's born out of superiority and entitlement. And in conclusion, I feel that the data reflects the notion of white privilege, which describes an invisible package of unearned assets that can be counted on and cashed in every day while remaining oblivious to the advantage earned by those that benefit from that. And this can, as Bhopal points out, this can include power and resources and accolades and systems of support, which I saw in my data. This was particularly the case for white males. While there are, of course, limitations to my research because of the very small sample that I was working with of ethnic minority academics in particular, and especially males, it does mean that there were limits to the analysis that I could conduct. However, based on the data gathered, I think there's sufficient insight here to suggest that the institutional culture can produce a system of power that silences and normalizes discriminatory practices, reflecting Bourdieu's notion of symbolic violence. So what this means is that social hierarchies and social inequalities in higher education are produced and maintained by symbolic domination less than by physical force. But people are just denied within the system. They're denied the resources, treated as inferior, or being limited in terms of their realistic aspirations. So I'll end there, thank you, and I'll be very happy to take any questions if you have them.
That's great, Karen. Thank you very much. Very
Thank you.
interesting presentation. If you wouldn't mind taking down your PowerPoint, because oops, sorry. If you wouldn't mind taking down your PowerPoint, because then I can see the gallery a bit better and just see if anyone has their hands up. I was just wondering if anyone has any questions for Karen about this presentation.
Apologies, I'm just trying to
That's
remove
okay, don't worry.
my slides and I can't find how to do that, but let me have a look. I'll try.
You just stop sharing. If you go down to the bottom, there should be an option to stop sharing your screen.
Ah, there it is. It was hidden by a message.
There we go.
Okay,
Right.
okay, I've done it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right. Did anyone have any questions? I mean, I can kick off if you like. Oh, Vuoko, did you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. All right, thank you so much. This was very interesting, but I need to say that I can clearly see these same results in the Finnish higher education context as well. Even we do not have the same level of, let's say, these minority groups to the extent that, like in other, for example, UK. But my question is, I was thinking when I followed your presentation and your slides that what are those forces that generate these imbalances continuously? That you can find them all the time and from different research findings and results. And what are those internal? Because I think they are internal forces inside the university. There are different people actually. We can refer to structures, but structures does not act. So they are people who act. But how this all can be regenerated all the time? That is my question. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. Yeah.
Gosh, it's a big question. I don't know if I can answer it fully, but I suppose I can lend my my insight as best I can from some of the research I've conducted. I mean, yeah, I mean, the higher education sector, I think, is it's very traditional. It's been built on very traditional structures that you know, these, if you just look at one aspect of this, the prestige economy that exists, that for example, that just the small thing where you know, how many people get invited to be a keynote speaker, things like being invited to be an editor of a journal, it's extremely hard for women, and particularly ethnic minority women, to get these opportunities. They just somehow get overlooked in the, you know, in the discussions at the table. It's, you know, there is a sort of you know, we do have the masculine, dominant white male masculine prototype leader that creates role incongruity for women. When you think leader, you think male. When you think, you know, expert in something, unfortunately, the first thing that comes to mind is often male. So there are all those issues which I've touched on here, but then there's also this silencing that goes on and the discomfort around talking about these things. And I think that, you know, on the one hand, we're very, you know, at least we exist in a system where we can do the research and we can publish it and we can talk about it quite openly. But when it actually comes to bringing about change in practice, that can be very, very uncomfortable for people, you know. And just to give an example, you know, the my report on this research was shared, you know, with various groups, and I had a student who worked with me on the project who created graphic art illustrations to bring to life some of the key findings. So we had one on the tick boxing, which I struggled to say earlier for some reason. The tick boxing, we had a little hamster wheel with tick boxing and all the different things that, you know, the tick boxing exercises that we see. And I was hoping to use some of that as just a discussion point in staff get-togethers and staff days, and you know, just to generate discussion. And it was actually really hard. People weren't comfortable with it. So yeah, so sorry, I don't think I've answered it fully, but just to touch on a few examples, it's just it's really complex, and because it's often beneath this veneer of normality, I think it's very difficult. I think a lot of people are just in denial, as some of my data showed. No, everything's fine. People report discrimination, of course they do, you know, and that was seen very differently between different groups.
There's a question in the chat, Karen, from Kirsty Hughes asking, do you have a sense of whether working part-time fed into this disparity?
I wasn't able to examine that in depth because you can already see from the numbers of staff that I had, the number of participants, breaking it down even further into part-time, full-time, etc., wouldn't have really been particularly feasible in this study. But I do know from the wider literature that there are disparities for staff who are on you know, different contract types, so different terms of contract, especially if you're not, if you don't have a permanent contract, then you know, you really don't have you're in a very precarious position, obviously, speaking out about any feelings that you've got that, you know, things aren't right, that you're being disadvantaged, you're not being supported, etc. You know, you really are very vulnerable, aren't you? So I think that that does make a difference, part-time and contract type, sorry.
Was there anyone else who might have a question? I thought that the one quote about the pub was interesting.
Yes, yeah.
And that kind of participation in kind of social activity that some people are not, you know, just I thought that was interesting just because certainly in professional services in HR, this is now kind of actively discouraged. And this type of
The sound briefly there. I lost the sound. I don't know if that was across the group or just me.
sorry, I just thought it was interesting because certainly in professional services HR, that sort of people going to the pub and it being not a very inclusive activity. There are a lot of warnings about that.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I'm just kind of surprised. Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, and I don't know what my question is here. But is that also something that is actively talked about in the kind of professorial circles, or is it still happens, basically? I was kind of surprised by that.
I was surprised it came up too, because for me that would have been a really obvious one. It's been widely discussed in literature for years, but then I guess, you know, that's that's my field. I have done that. So perhaps for other people who aren't, you know, some people who aren't in that field, maybe that isn't, you know, doing equality, diversity and inclusion work. I mean, you know, perhaps that isn't as obvious, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't a sort of wide. I think this was the one possibly two reference to that, but I was surprised it came up too.
Okay.
And as you say, you would think that that would not be the case anymore, that there would be much more, you know, greater consideration of the implications of going to the pub for different groups of staff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, I'm going to, just being conscious of time, I'm going to ask our next speakers to share their wisdom with us. This is Manny Mandriaga and Lindy Ann Blaze Alfred, who are going to be speaking on Our Silence in Meetings is Not a Fear. Is the Inclusion University Committee meeting inclusive? So over to you, Manny.
Thank you, Claire. I'll start.
Oh, sorry,
And then
Lindy.
hand over to Manny. That's fine.
No, that's all right, Lindy. Can you hear me as well?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay,
I can
cool.
hear you.
All
And we
right.
can see the slides. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for that, Karen. Before we start, we want to acknowledge the contributions of our ancestors, friends, predecessors, practitioners, and other researchers who have paved the way for Manny and I to be here today. And to quote Isaac Newton, if we have seen further, it is because we have been standing on the shoulders of giants.
Mhm.
And just bringing us into the space of what we are here to talk about today. We are looking at the terms of inclusion and inclusive, and we want to acknowledge as well that they are contested in some ways. And in this session, we are going to tell you a story about our experiences, and it's underpinned by the literature and our research. And we are looking at inclusion in this sense is in these spaces as places where there's difference, there's representation, there's diversity, but there isn't any equity, which speaks to power of voice and the value at which they labor that racially minoritized colleagues is valued. So our argument is that these spaces can never be inclusive. Manny,
Yeah, I'm trying to move.
you seem to have disappeared.
Oh, sorry. Here you go. I found it. Okay. Thank you, Lindy Ann. Okay, so our project is informed by it's informed by critical race theory. It's informed by particularly the work of Victor Ray and the theory of racialized organizations. Although he's talking about racialized organizations in general, or organizations in general, we are applying it to the academy, to the university itself. There's a sense of permanence of racism embedded within this, and this is consistent and congruent with what was the paper before us. And there have been critical questions about whether race equity could ever be conjured in UK higher education. And I'm shouting out Calvin Bhopal and my colleague Martin Myers, as well as the recent work of David Roberts at Loughborough and his evaluation of the implementation of race equality initiatives throughout the sector. Amidst this despair, I guess, amidst this stuff that the previous paper and we're presenting today, Lindy Ann and I are just trying to make sense and find a time or a space just to breathe within this despairing nature of the academy as folks of color. Speaking for just Lindy Ann and I, we get invited to many EDI events. We get invited to many seats in different EDI committees throughout the sector. Just speaking on my behalf, I question my presence and performance in these spaces in terms of my own professional development. And so based on that, we both employed for this particular paper, we employed Charles Milner's work on self-study, which is a form of narrative inquiry on his own race equity work as a university teacher in the States. So we're taking the self-study approach, offering a counter narrative on the representation of folks like us who work in the area of EDI. I would say, speaking for the both of us, that we're not here to share the trauma we experience on the daily. We're here to offer a way forward in the racial reparative work needed for the benefit of our colleagues and our students. And this is all encapsulated in the whole notion of that space that we have to engage in called the EDI meeting. And Lindy Ann will share her thoughts about that.
So as I said before, this is a story of not just one meeting. It's an amalgamation of many meetings and experiences where the actors change, but the same narratives dominate. And as Karen alluded to on her, I think her final slide, some of these meetings are often, and in my experience, experienced as a form of violence. And I use Johan Galtung's definition as the difference between the potential and the actual. So thinking of how these spaces are designed, what are they supposed to do and what actually happens. So I experienced that violence in several ways. The first example really is the difference between the power I inhabit being sometimes the only intersectional one. So I am a woman, I'm of African descent, I'm from the Caribbean. So all of those identities bring different nuances into the room. But I am working, I recognize, in a milieu of disconsciousness. So King in 1991 defines it as that uncritical habit of mind, which allows, people's perceptions and assumptions and beliefs, despite being there, to do something positive to support the status quo. And the result of that is that voices like mine are largely ignored. And I said it's almost like Vicky Pollard. Yes, that's a good point, but no, but so there's that dynamic. The picture here is also important. I use the description of a wall of white to describe my experience of walking into an open plan office. There were probably about 150 people because it was a huge space above a library. There was no one in that room that looked like me, not even someone with dark hair. And I think my instinctive thing is culturally, something is wrong with this space. And then arguably structurally as well, which means that certain groups are prohibited from that space. And I say prohibited because it's not a matter of qualifications. It's not a matter of being a suitably, engaged in the profession, but there is something that is happening, which means that colleagues like myself from the global majority are not recognized or don't feel that sense of belonging. To some extent, my day job means that I have to accept a certain level of violence because I'm involved in race literacy training. And I often have to repress my own sense of hurt or anxiety or any negative feelings because I need to put the needs and feelings of others first. And so that acceptable level, I signed up for that. Sometimes I think it's a form of self-harm if we continue to use that violence, that analogy of violence. And because in situations where some people can react instinctively to a microaggression or even an overt form and are praised for being assertive or raw or authentic, I am often reserved because I am mindful of how I might be perceived or received. Will I be seen as aggressive or unprofessional? Will I be seen as weak? Because sometimes your instinct is to cry out of frustration. How do we manage that internally? And then, similar to microaggressions, I use microviolence when I'm in a community of people, and this is anybody in a room, and we have the same thoughts around decolonization, for example. And I attended an event recently, and we were talking, we had many good ideas about what we should be doing, about our practice, about our images on our slides. And then the presenter showed an example of the slide, and of all the examples of people of African descent that person could have chosen, they were both sticking their tongues out and had, the caricature. For me, as a person of African descent, is almost a caricature of what you see people of African descent looking like in so many images. So in the middle of this sense of, yes, solidarity, you get this attack. So you almost always have to be on the alert for different forms of violence in these spaces.
Thanks. Okay. So Lindy Ann offered a story on her experiences. What we offer here are counter stories. So I'm bringing in a story based on our shared experience, informed by the tradition of critical race theory, where we create composite characters based on not even the people that we have interviewed through my own research, but just based on the stories that Lindy Ann have shared in preparation for this paper. So I conjured this character Mo, and this will lead into ideas about joy and things moving forward. So Mo is a colleague who started a mentoring scheme for PGR students, and it was under kind of duress in a way, due to PGR students of color trying to find affinity, trying to find that one person in the corridor that looks like them. And I would say it's not trying to make a trope of a story here, or we just need to be conscious of this is a story that I've heard, that Lindy and I have heard many times in our travelings throughout the sector doing this work about students of color looking for staff members that look like them and trying to get some advice, feedback on their assessments or whatever. But so I concentrated on this character, this character of Mo, who's an academic colleague, and his story has been rewritten and drawn regarding this unofficial mentoring of PGR students of color in an ad hoc way. And this kind of work, as we know of folks of color, is never workloaded, is not accounted for work plans. So Mo, knowing that there's a lot of students drawn to him because of his support and rapport and his political activism, wants to help out, and he sends an email out to enhance capacity for this mentoring work to other staffs of color within his institution. And someone who fits that description that he's looking for lands in the email inbox in the HR. So an HR member of staff catches wind of it and invites Mo to a forthcoming EDI committee meeting to share the good happenings of what happens in the institution. I guess one of the things I want to highlight here is that prior to Mo's entrance into that meeting, and this HR person is also a person of color, conducts a pre-meet to prepare him to share about the different obstacles that will be thrown his way and the different questions and the different kinds of posturing in order to prepare for the EDI committee meeting. We also want to highlight here is the meeting after the meeting, and maybe some folks in this room will understand what we're on about here. It's the meeting after the meeting where we're just processing, was I just attacked was that just a racist thing? Was I just microaggressed? So this is what we've come up to the idea just based on our stories. In that sharing of the pre-meet and the post-meet of an EDI meeting, for instance, or actually we're foregrounding at the moment, is that we refer here as perhaps a breathing space. And I'm taking this from some previous work I've done with a colleague about race staff forums around, or we call BAME staff networks that are within different institutions to follow their Equality Act objectives. And we say that when folks meet like that in the pre-meet or post-meet, it's a place of respite, it's a breathing space. We can actually be ourselves. It's where a colleague in the States, Antar Chichavakunda, highlighted where places of Black joy can be experienced in predominantly white institutions. It's in those spaces where the magic happens, and it's where we have found through our experience of the pre-meetings or the post-meetings of folks of color, just to make sense of what's going on. Where we started, Lindy and Ann, our goal has not changed. Our focus has always been on working with hope, solidarity, community to resist. And this paper presentation is a perfect example. This process, bringing this presentation together was not only just a catch up between Lindy and I, because we're friends, but as Lindy Ann would say, it was a lime. Regardless of how it started, what it illustrates, particularly for colleagues of color, is how we network and support each other in these spaces. For our racial and majoritized groups, it's about relationships and spaces. These kind of meeting spaces are replicated in other spaces where 2 or 3 individuals are gathered, sheltered from the extremities and the violence that we are exposed to.
And I think Manny has already started with one of the 3 messages we wanted you to take away from this talk. And, you know, he started with the idea of how can we create these spaces of affirmation. But as the picture shows that for those who benefit from or enact the powers of whiteness to survive, it's the need to acknowledge the scale of the problem And the image here I have used to illustrate poet Kyle Tranmyre's quote of white supremacy is not the shark, it is the ocean. And it speaks to the question that was asked previously about how these things are perpetuated, but also it conveys that idea that combating racism requires addressing and understanding the broader systemic issues rather than just individual acts. And part of that is to recognize that our racial consciousness has been shaped by hegemonic narratives on race. So our racial literacy, we have lots of racial literacy sessions, but we have to recognize that our racial literacy started the minute we became conscious of ourselves, either by omission or by having to deal with it daily. We have forms of racial literacy already existing. And unless we are able to actively and intentionally articulate or even interrogate what it means to swim in this ocean. And some of us are swimming with breathing aids and life jackets, and some of us are swimming with putty or clay or bricks around our ankles. So what does that mean for each group in terms of making room, sponsoring, being an accomplice, collaborating, or mentoring? So how do we then start to create these spaces of respite and joy that Manny alluded to?
Okay, so we're taking stuff in terms of thinking of a way forward, we are claiming affirmative methodology. So it stems from affirming research methodologies, which works off decolonizing research methodologies, but we're appropriating that because we like the ethos behind the calls for decolonizing the curriculum, because it stems from efforts to humanize higher education. We want our ways of being and knowing to be recognized, not to be dismissed. Hence our push of learning from indigenous ways, specifically Caribbean ways of being and knowing, and considering a way forward in engaging university work, such as a EDI committee meeting. And I'll pass it on to Lindy Ann to explain.
Yeah, and if anyone has any friends from Trinidad, you've heard the phrase liming. And liming is not, it's a space for resistance. It's a space where hierarchies are temporarily dissolved and where power is diffused. And in a lime, what you're trying to do is create an atmosphere where people are open to be challenged, where people are hold the space for the others around them. So Naked's work references this very clearly. And one of the ways to disperse power is to think about what is my role in this. So I often say that my role in this would be the old talker. So the person who is the old talker is the person who will, try to maintain a dynamic of synergy, a sort of positive energy by using humor or by, almost calling out people to hold them into the conversation. You can have the person who's a provocateur who brings a challenge and critique to the conversation. You have the listeners, the connectors who synthesizes ideas and keeps the conversation flowing. But the essence of this space is that there isn't that triangular hierarchy. There isn't, and there's a sense of everybody belongs and everybody's voice is heard.
Okay, is it me, Lindy Ann, now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. In conclusion, thank you. We're aware of the notion of a racialized community. We talked about we need a breathing space. We still operate within it, so we need a breathing space. This is a joint self-study, Lindy Ann and I, to enhance not only our professional development, but to build up our colleagues and students to engage in racial reparative work that requires crossing racial divides and creating space for healing and restoration. We have considered moves in decolonizing this work. The path we are suggesting here reflects the ethos behind the call for indigenous methodologies, particularly Caribbean methodologies such as liming and old talk. We desire our ways of being and knowing to not be dismissed. We seek to humanize higher education, beginning with the EDI committee. Like the EDI committee in theory should be a safe space to work towards repair, seeking that joy. And that's what we have. So any questions for Lindy Ann and I? And thank you, Claire, for sharing.
Thank you for that, Manny. Would you mind, that's fantastic, thank you. So I can see people's faces and any hands that are raised. We've got a few claps, and I think that people have enjoyed the conversation. We were meant to have another speaker after you, but I think they must be unwell. So this will be the final presentation. So I can see that Labake has her hand raised. Labake, did you want to pose a question to our speakers?
Oh, hello.
Hi, Labake.
I was looking for, anyway, it's fine. Maybe, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I joined your presentation. I'm not sure enjoy is the word I would use. It's more of so many emotions, and not in the least, maybe it's a good time to also introduce myself, Claire, as the chair of the new SRHE EDI working group. And of course, I'm also the EDI director for my school in Edinburgh. So I'm based at the University of Edinburgh, Memorial School of Education and Sport. And I've needing a space, you know, to a safe space and a brave space to download, to kind of second guess what just happened in that EDI meeting.
Yeah.
It's something I think a lot of folks don't even know happens. So maybe the way you can highlight that even more is very important. I would say in my experience, this safe space actually has not always been with people like me. It's actually been with white allies that I've grown to trust, Claire being one of them. So I'm bold to say that I can share this trauma that we go through. I mean, even in this conference, I can say safely that I've attended a session today that trauma was reenacted.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so difficult to share it because you have to deal with how the minoritized group, simple white folks, feel about this thing. But when you go through this trauma over and over again, it does leave a mark on you. Coincidentally, today my paper came out. This is a shameless plug, but I am so proud, actually, that I can share today that I just finished a special issue, editing a special issue, and I had a paper in it, which is centrality. I will put the link in the chat. It's about moving away from positionality. I think positionality is one of the saddest things that has happened to advancing the colonial work, actually. And it's been criticized in the literature. So the paper brings it all together. I love that photo you have that had the different cups, you know. It's about everybody being central to that conversation. We're not saying destroy whatever science has put in place. We're saying everybody needs to be central rather than hegemonic structures. It's not so much as a question, but more as an affirmation of everything you've said. And also open that, how do we take this forward? How do we take this forward? How do we not just stay in the state of repair? But how do we advance the knowledge that it will become something we talk about in your research or in your work? Maybe that is now my question. Do you have like allies? Santos talks about, you know, the line. I talk about that in my paper as well. Those who are on either side of the line. Have you considered this, removing that line and building together with allies? Because we all need to be involved in this work.
Yeah. Lindy Ann, you about to say something?
No, you go ahead first.
Oh, no, thank you for staying with us and thank you for what you shared. I just wanted for taking it forward. I'm presenting on Friday about hope and working with allies or whatever, and you would please think in my research, there's 2 research projects I cited about breathing space. So we find joy. There are spaces of joy when we're amongst ourselves. We do laugh even though we feel the despair, yeah, inside the universities. And we know when we laugh, we know when we have lunch with our friends, there are spaces, and those are vital and important, significant things in our lives. I was going to make a comment that you made about allies and ally work, is that there are senior managers in the sector who identify themselves as a white man or white woman who do a lot of anti-racist work, who do that work and do it to the point where I go, I need you on my side. I have evidence of that, and they're on the side of racial repair, racial restoration, and journeying towards hope. And one of the things that for Lindy Ann, I'll speak for myself, but I think Lindy Ann shares this, is that we know that we exist in this racialized academy, but there are spaces, from the spaces of hope and joy, is where we push forward. Yeah, when we know that we have that sense of the community, and we know that we have each other, we know that we can always fall back on each other for not only to laugh, but also to cry. Yeah. So I think we know we have to have those spaces in order to take that work forward. So that's my little go. And also a shameless plug for my Friday paper.
Thank you. I think for me, you asked a few questions and start with the idea of the ally. I don't use that term ally again because you always have to, use active with it to demonstrate the sort of relationship that you want. I use the term of an equity accomplice. And when we think of accomplice, you think of somebody who it doesn't have positive connotations, but the root of accomplice means to enter into, to walk alongside. And it has also compassion in their passion and that sort of energy. So I want someone who, when they witness something, they feel that pain with me. So I don't have that emotional labor on my own. So so that's the first thing that I seek out, those accomplices. And then you asked about that line, and I thought there's so many ways I can answer that question. First of all, part of me thinks that line that line is the water, You're either for me or against me. And part of that accomplished journey is for me to be able to communicate that quite clearly, and to recognize that either for me or against me, there's no in between. And so I work acknowledging that line is there. And I spend 20% of my time potentially trying to erase that line. But 80% of my time is spent on people who are on the other side of that line. And that's one way of me preserving my energy for the long haul, because we know that something structured like this, it's a phased approach, but a long journey. And we need to be able to find those spaces to re-energize and to find that sustenance to move on. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for sharing all that. And it's a constant battle, isn't it? And it is a long, long process. So I was just going to type that, so true, and look forward to learning more about your work and working together on this journey. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions, and we have drawn to the end of the period for this talk. As I've said, the final speaker is unable to join us, it looks like, so we will stop here. And I did want to thank all of our speakers. I wanted to thank Karen Jones, Manny Madriaga, and Lindy Ann Blaise Alfred. Thank you so much. Very interesting sessions, very thought-provoking. great to hear from you, and I hope to see you at conference as well. If I could encourage people to come back for the 5 o'clock session, just a quick reflection, and we'll be sharing the link to the conference survey, which we'd be really grateful if people could complete, because if we don't have feedback, we don't know how to improve things going forward. So please do join us at 5 o'clock for a very brief session. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye now. Susie, do you need anything from me?
Not really. Can I end?
I think so. I don't think anyone will show up in the last 5 minutes for this last talk. It's a shame that the speaker couldn't join us, but as you said, they didn't come to the earlier session, or somebody told me that they didn't come to the earlier session.
Yeah,
so
they did.
there must be something wrong. So, okay. So we'll just close it off here, and I'll see you again, hopefully at 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Susie.
Okay.
Thanks for your
Bye.
help. Bye now.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.